Hello, everybody, and welcome to Jeremy. It's been a while since we've gotten together for Matt and Miner in the morning. This is actually more of a Matt and Miner in the afternoon, as we're recording this here Tuesday, and we wanted to come to you guys with some information on stock rots, on some of the I guess the menagerie of harvest standability issues that we've seen. We wanted to explore their causes a little bit. Jeremy, thank you for setting this up and for what kind of being the driving force behind this training.
No problem at all. We definitely want to have a conversation around this topic, whether it's stock rots, standability issues. We are at November 9th, and harvest is still wrapping up. So we've had a couple of different wind events, rain events that have exposed some things in some fields. And I think it's good that we just have that conversation around these types of issues. And better yet, we should probably just grab an expert and have our first guest on our little podcast, our little discussion here. So, who do we have, Matt?
We've got Dr. Alison Robertson from Iowa State joining us today. Allison is the ISU Extension Field Crops pathologist and a great colleague of ours, someone we really enjoy working with, and whose expertise we appreciate. So, Allison, thanks for taking some time to hop on Matt and Miner in the afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
We know you're busy, and you're probably busy with some of the same things we've been dealing with as agronomists, which is phone calls about stock quality and standability. And Jeremy, I kind of like the funny images that you've put in here about what happened during the 2021 growing season.
Uh,
Things were great, and then we got to harvest.
On the left side, yeah, when harvest started, I think things were going well. We didn't have a lot of weather issues at all. Things were going quite smoothly. And then there were a couple events that came through, specifically in October, with some high winds from different directions, some rain events, some more, a lot of places, at least in my area, had more rain in October than they had the entire summer. So yeah, I thought those pictures really set it off right there.
And I think to clarify, we have not seen these issues everywhere uniformly across the state. Certainly, it's been in pockets. I would say, and Allison and Jeremy chime in, probably north central Iowa, certainly eastern Iowa, as Jeremy, get into your area from Interstate 80 north. I think so. I think that corresponds with a couple different issues this year that we'll certainly get into. But no, harvest was not this way everywhere, but where it was challenging, it really got challenging in a hurry.
That
That
is for
leads us
sure.
into this conversation, Jeremy, that I know you wanted to start with, which is on both stocks and roots. Kind of what do they do, and why are they important? I guess is how I'll tee this up.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that stocks and roots are important, and they do certain things at the time of the year. And we don't have to get into the weeds as far as that goes with what their specific functionality is down to the minute detail. But we know that there's a lot of water transfer and nutrient transfer that goes on through the entire plant and into the ear. The stalk and roots are there to basically hold everything up until that grain is formed, and then when they're done, the plant's done, it's reached maturity, and everything breaks down, and just like with the rest of the residue, the stalks go too. Um, the issues that we've been seeing this year just have, I don't know, it really seems like there's just a lot of factors that come into play here. A lot of people want to say, hey, this hybrid is doing this. It's the hybrid's fault. And I think there's a lot of other things that we want to talk about that maybe lead us into that disease conversation or stock rot conversation. And, those are good things that we're going to talk about today. Allison, I hope I get bonus points for this. I have the disease triangle on here. So, we talk about host pathogen environment, whether that's leaf diseases or stalk rots. And we know that plants under higher stress have higher chances of disease infection.
Right.
So hopefully going through this conversation today, we can look at some of these diseases and see if there's anything, whether it was weather related or just growth stage related, those types of things that can maybe help narrow down some of these issues that we've been seeing out there.
Yeah, and Allison, the disease triangle is in here. Why don't you? I know this is something that gets done a lot, but talk us through what that really means in a practical sense.
So everyone knows that I'm obsessed with the disease triangle, and really because that explains what's going on, right? So the disease triangle is basically we talk about there are three factors. And only when we have those three factors do we get disease, right? So we're looking at stalk rots, root rots, crown rots. So the pathogens that cause those are pathogens that live in the soil. They're endemic to Iowa soils. That means that they're present in every soil. So we always have the pathogen there, right? Then we have the host. In this case, that's corn. And we have corn in the field. So obviously it's a host. You did talk about genetics. Remember that these hybrids come from different genetic backgrounds, right? And so some of them are going to have characteristics that are going to make them more or less susceptible to infection by these pathogens. And then, of course, we have the environment. And I always think the environment is the biggest driver of any disease. And when we talk about the environment, that can be anything from just temperature and moisture, but it can also include like nutrition. Did you run out of nitrogen? Plant population. Did you plant, that hybrid at the wrong population, and that stressed out the plant? Drought stress. That's part of the environment. So the environment is just basically everything else. And when all of those come together, then we can get this disease developing.
Yeah, that's when all three get together, Allison. That's when the party starts, which
At
we seem
least
to
for
have,
me.
at least for you. That's definitely.
We're having a party.
Yep.
Jeremy, this has been a common sight this year, unfortunately, in some areas.
Yeah, it has. And, it could be a channel hybrid, it could be a competitor hybrid, and it could be on either side of this picture here. But I mean, as we got into October, I think we learned that some of these products were mature much sooner rather than later, and this year was pretty unique in that front. So yeah, this is the question of the month or the season, the harvest season right now, is what's going on here. So glad we get to talk about it.
Yeah, and as we try to break that down, Allison, I wanted kind of your expertise here. We talked about what we know stocks and roots do. We're going to get into some specifics on four or five, crown rots and stalk rots here in a second. But I wanted to start with what we know about these diseases versus what we don't. Is there anything here that jumps out at you from things that we know about why these diseases infect that are so important, and then anything on the flip side that maybe we don't know about these pathogens that makes them so challenging?
I think that you summarized that really well. Just higher yield potential fields. When that corn's really sucking all those carbohydrates, that plant is photosynthesizing like crazy, maybe not quite getting enough of, maybe not being able to photosynthesize as effectively as possible, like the dry conditions we had. So now it needs to go to the stalk and the roots and grab those sugars. So yeah, higher yield potential fields. Senescing and stress plants, maybe rather than infect, I would say, more prevalent on senescing or stress plants.
Sure.
The longer we leave that corn standing in the field, the more time that stalk rot has to develop. And so, and we've done some research on that, as I'm sure there's many agronomists, and you just know that from your work. Insect injury, any wounds, you can get infection climbing in on and starting to decay there. And then, direct and indirect loss, right? So the direct loss would be where you're not getting enough sugars, maybe you're getting some tip dieback or something. Indirect would be, ears not being picked up because they're lying on the ground. So, but like you say, there's a lot we don't know. And so that's why, as a pathologist, we spend a lot of time trying to understand when those plants get infected, what are the conditions favoring them. And so I'm not sure that we really understand, when stalk rots and crown rots infect. Do they infect in the spring? And then, I know that I can go out in the spring and I can isolate Fusarium from a corn plant. But
Mhm.
does that necessarily mean that that's going to cause stalk rot at the end of the growing season? And was it that infection that caused the stalk rot, or an infection that happened later, maybe through some insect wounds or something to the stalk? I feel like the more that I look at stalk rots and crown rots, the less that I know. You have the accurately screening. One of the things when companies are developing these resistant hybrids is they have to infect those hybrids, right, with the pathogen and then see if they're resistant or not. And I'm not sure that we have the tools. We know how to inoculate these plants to get disease. And yeah, and then how do we manage that inoculum? Yeah, I mean, those are all really good points. And like I say, the more I look into this, the more I think I don't know anything.
That reminds me, Allison, your point on screening for these. What's the old joke? We have the technology, we have the power. Well, screening for these, right? A lot of times it means someone has to go and inject the crown of plants, plant
Yes,
by plant, with a needle. That is
yes,
one very labor intensive. But from what I understand of it, from
yeah,
what I've seen, which we test in Central Iowa, it's just not very effective. It can
yeah,
maybe only infect that localized area of the stalk. So when you do maybe check for breakage scores, it's very difficult to accurately assert that. And the one thing I did want to circle back to, Allison, that you mentioned was um, this idea of less of infecting plants and more of a question of the prevalence of it in plants. And I think that's something that's very important to understand. It's sometimes not a question of is it there. It's a question of when did it get there, I guess, because I have seen plants with very well developed ears. Say a farmer's picking a field today on November 9th, and his yield potential is very, very high, but he's seeing stalk breakage and lodging. And sometimes that can be genetic, as we talked about, but I think, in some cases I find stalk rots in those fields, but the ear very visibly was not really affected. So
yes,
it's not, when did it affect? It's how long has this hybrid been out here? How long has this stalk rot had time to weaken this stalk after the hybrid matured? So I think that's a very important, and my wording here is probably not great. I would agree. It's not necessarily about the infection. It's about the prevalence of that disease.
yeah. But you bring up a good point, Matt, because this is something that I always struggle with, right? When is stalk rot a disease? And if you think of a disease that impacts yield, right? Then that would mean that stalk rot that occurs before physiological maturity is the disease. Whatever happens after physiological maturity is just natural decomposition of that plant,
That's a great
you
point.
know? And so I always struggle with that a little bit. So yeah.
That's a great point, and one we probably don't. I know I certainly probably have never really made. So, um, with kind of that background, we're going to jump into just a quick run through of the five big stock routes that I know we've really been seeing this year. There are certainly others, but this is um, your IPM certification here. If you're a CCA, this is kind of nuts, meats and potatoes for us as agronomists. But I wanted to start with anthracnose, and Jeremy and Allison, jump in if you have any comments on what we're seeing this year. I've actually seen probably less anthracnose this year than some of the
Mhm,
others that I will be covering.
mhm,
I think it was just not a great year for infection wise. We didn't have some of the cloudy weather we've had in past years. Boy, I think back to, was it 2019? We had 15% less solar radiation, and I seem to find a little bit more.
mhm,
And we did not see the top dieback that's normally associated with this
mhm,
disease, as you mentioned, Allison, the plant dying from the top to the bottom. But this is, still very prevalent across the Corn Belt, where we see these black kind of lesions on the outside of the stalk that turn it that color, and obviously the deterioration of the pith inside the plant. This is one that I think companies have started to great for, and actually develop some traits for. I know
mhm.
Bayer has a native anthracnose stock rot trait that they've started to integrate into some hybrids. So this one I think I wanted to put first because it's one that I think a lot of us have a fairly good understanding of, and do understand that. I think most hybrids actually, Allison, probably have scores for this
Yes.
disease, which is rare when you compare it to the rest of the stock rots we're going to talk about.
And it's just interesting too, Matt, that you point out that I agree with you. This year, I don't think I have
Yeah.
seen a year where there has been so little anthracnose seen out there. I mean, it just very unusual for a disease like that that comes in. So just not seeing a lot of it for sure.
So I totally agree with you guys. I never saw a lot of the blackening on the outside of the rind. Now, a colleague of mine from Kentucky and I just wrote a feature article about anthracnose, and I learned in that article that you don't always see that blackening on the outside of the rind. And so that makes me wonder if
Mhm.
we have misdiagnosed anthracnose sometimes for fusarium when we get to that where we don't have anything in the outside. But I mean, that would be something that would be interesting to look at. And I haven't investigated very much of that. But yeah, for the most part, I would just say anthracnose, blackening on the outside. This year, we didn't see a lot of that blackening. Does that mean we had less anthracnose? Possibly. Yeah.
Sure. Hard to say. I did not know that. So you definitely learn something new every day.
I'm taking notes, Matt.
Wonderful. Let's say I should. We're getting as much out of this as hopefully the audience will. This next one I have seen quite a bit of, and that is Gibbsella stock rot, caused by our old friend Fusarium, which seems to be the root of all problems in corn and soybeans when it comes to diseases. So it primarily infects after pollination, and you can see these tiny round, and I have seen some of actually that are almost a bluish black color. Um, and I'm probably going to. I always struggle with this word, Allison. It's the parathecia, correct?
Yes.
On the
Excellent.
first stalk internodes. I'm not a biologist by trade, so um, I think the reason I've seen so much of this, Allison, is because of the conditions that it looks for, warm, wet conditions right after silking. As we think about our year, we had fairly dry. Conditions were certainly stressful prior to pollination, but it was dry. We were dry even at planting.
Mhm.
But I think the warmer, wet weather we got as you get into that, I would think it's probably more like 3 to 4 weeks after pollination in places, is where I've seen a lot of this in the obviously you can see the pink color of the infection in those upper nodes. Where I've seen this manifest is in stalk breakage, where I will go into fields and find the stalks broken, a couple feet above the ground, usually about a foot below the ear, and you can almost always find that pink discoloration immediately at those nodes, where that pith is eaten away, and you just have those vascular bundles left. So this one I think has been a big disease this year.
Mhm. I agree.
Allison, do we know like when, we talked about this a little earlier about when the infection comes in, but when should we be looking for Gibberella stock rot? Is that something that is going to um, show up earlier rather than later when it comes to relative maturity, or does it really matter?
I don't think it matters that much. I mean, most of the time that I start looking for stalk rots, kind of half milk line, and then through after physiological maturity. This year we looked, around about dent, and I didn't notice any jib then. So yeah, I mean, most of the time, our suggestions are if you're concerned about stalk rots to go out around about physiological maturity and split those stems and see what's going on. And so yeah, I still stand by that. We've been doing some research, this year, and when we went in earlier, we didn't see anything. So
Sure.
yeah. I was going to say that I'm going back to Gibberella stalk rot.
Yes.
I mean, I know there's not a lot of silage produced here in Iowa, but this is one Gibberella, the Fusarium species is one that produces mycotoxins. So Damon Smith from Wisconsin was just able to show, that if you see this and you're harvesting for silage, then which would be a lot earlier, obviously, than physiological maturity, then there can be a risk of mycotoxins in that silage. So, um, yeah, just something to think about.
And this is an aside, Allison, but correct me if I am wrong. The infection, uh, similar infection, right? That can infect the ear. It just has to do
Yeah,
more where it actually infects on the
yeah,
plant determines what type of the rot it
yeah,
causes. Correct?
yeah.
Okay.
So if we get infection through the silks, we'll get Gibberella ear rot.
Right.
Same concerns, right? Mycotoxins.
Moving on to Fusarium, I know Allison, you mentioned that earlier as well. And there are several kind of again species within the or different pathogens within that Fusarium species that can infect. I've actually seen more of this, I think, this year than I have in years past. Probably more than I expected, and it's really been noticeable with this outer growth, this white growth on the stalks. I jump back a slide. Um, been pretty visible this year on some of the fields that I've gone out and looked at. It's almost one that you can mistake easily with a few other diseases. But I think again the reason for this one would be it's favored by warm and dry weather before silking, and then warm and wet after silking, which is again what we
Mhm.
tended to find. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but I've actually seen this I think more, Allison, in fields with corn rootworm feeding. Several of those were rotated feeding where I think extended diapause was the cause, and the feeding was very minimal, but I think possibly enough to get the infection into the plant. No, I think normally when we're used to talking about Fusarium, it is Fusarium crown rot, but this stalk rot can certainly cause problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is some of these species can actually be carried in the seed as well.
Hmm,
And then they move into the stalk and just sit there and wait until that plant gets stressed, and then they start to colonize and cause the stalk rot.
it's a good call. Jeremy, anything on this one?
I've seen a little bit of it, but probably more in the crown rot fashion versus the
Mhm.
stalk rot. I'm sure it's there though. And there we
Which is
go.
what we're yeah, which
Thank
is what
you.
we're going to jump to. Everyone's least favorite disease. I found a really good quote on this, Allison, from Iowa State, which was what crown rots really do, where the damage comes from is that disruption of the plumbing
Mhm.
of the plant. And if you think back to your agronomy 101, water and nutrients move up in the xylem from the roots as the stomata open during the day. It's what draws in water into the plants, and then the phloem is what kind of translocates sugars and nutrients throughout the plant. But all of that is anchored through the crown. That is one of the most important parts of the plant for getting nutrients up into the stalk. And um, it's very noticeable when you have this infection, right? And I didn't add pictures in here, but this is one that I know you can actually find signs of the infection well into the vegetative stages as you
Mhm.
split those crowns open. What we're looking for is, I'm going to use the laser pointer again. The tissue, a crown can be white to maybe a lighter tan color, but it should not be much darker than that. So we're looking for any of this dark brown tissue here, or sometimes you'll see it even on some of the roots that are adjacent to it. It's really favored by cool, wet springs followed by hot, dry conditions. This is one that can come and infect and start to take over in the crown, and then also kind of lie and cause problems once we get later into the year. I did find, as I'm kind of doing my review on this, uh, this is kind of where I wanted to talk about crown rot with you, Allison. Is as I'm saying, cool, wet springs. Most farmers are probably sitting here thinking, well, uh, we had neither of those. We had a warmer than usual spring, and we had very dry conditions. Where did this disease come from? It's actually no different from the sudden death conversation that we had on the soybean side. Conditions did not seem to favor that disease, but we still found more than expected. I think it's these other stressors that come into play as we think about what issues we normally deal with in spring, right, Allison? Things like herbicide injury, compaction, or even fertility issues can be the stress that's needed for crown rot to come in and infect.
Yes. Um, Crown rot is even more confusing to me than stalk rot. I mean, and we've certainly, I think that been seeing an increase in the amount of crown rot, the last couple of years. And so I'm a terrible pathologist, and a lot of times I blame it on genetics as well. Um, but yeah, and again, we've been doing some work on crown rot, and we've been isolating fusariums, but we've also been picking up some other organisms in there as well, pythium and anthracnose.
Sure.
And so just I mean, we're trying to get a better understanding of that. I think that infection does um, occur early, soon after planting, kind of like SDS. And then there's factors that come together later on during the growing, or well, anytime during the growing season, right? You can get crown
Right.
rot. Not like stalk rot is at the end. Crown rot can occur anytime. And so I think that you get this infection very early on, and then there's some sort of stress that just triggers that crown rot. And I am, and sure, herbicide injury, cold temperatures, fertility, but I mean, I I can't put a finger on the stress. So
Can be can be a lot of different causes for that. You're right, Alice. Especially in a year like this where the weather was so variable
yeah,
and really so extreme, whether it was
mhm,
temperature at times or extreme drought. So
yeah.
the last one I wanted to cover is Diplodia Stock Rot. Um, the more that I've looked for this, actually, I think the more I've seen it. I have tended to find this in the absolute driest part of my territory. So north central Iowa, some of the pockets around Marshall and Tama County where they did not catch rains all that favorably. Still had a very nice crop, but the so the Picadinia, which are those, kind of those fruiting bodies on the outsides of the stem on this one, actually cannot be scratched off with your finger like you could on some other stock rots. It usually feels rough and sandpapery. Where I have seen this one, where it's very noticeable to me, is this last bullet I have here, right? Pith deterioration without discoloration, and a lot of times there just be almost like a diamond-shaped gap in the pith on the lower part of the stalk or the upper part where there's just no pith. It looked like somebody parted it and pulled it apart. And that's what I've tended to see from Diplodia. Again, kind of that same pattern: dry weather prior to silking and warm weather afterwards. Less moisture driven on this one, but definitely I'm not going to say it's really super common, but I did find several fields that had Diplodia stock rot this fall.
I did not see any Diplodia stalk rot this fall, but yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's not usually that prevalent in Iowa anyway. So,
Right.
and I think it's easy to misdiagnose sometimes for Fusarium if you miss the little pycnidia on the outside of the stem. So, yeah.
Absolutely. We're going to jump into some real life scenarios. So we wanted to kind of show everybody some of the things that we've been dealing with. I don't know. Maybe I should have put a trigger warning on this for Allison, for Jeremy, and myself, and maybe for everybody watching. This was a real field that I went to look at. Here's kind of some of the characteristics. This hybrid is one that is probably more average on the drought in an agronomic perspective, Allison. So but this is what I tend to find in some of these products you would maybe deem across the industry as more offensive or racehorse type hybrids is
Yeah.
one that's
Yeah.
that's commonly used. So um, when I was called out, as you can see in the drone image, there was one product in the field that was standing well, and this one was not. It had obviously some issues. This was more stock breakage, as you can see in that picture. Actually no root lodging in the field. The stalks all kind of broken off at about the same point. And as I started to dig into these stalks, I actually found both some Gibbsella and also some Fusarium crown rot. Both, and I think you can probably see that from the roots there. That there's a little bit of both root and stalk infection, and the root masses were also very deteriorated. Jeremy and I have called this the case of the disappearing roots, Allison, where you can walk out into these fields and on some of these plants you can just yank them right out of the ground.
Mhm.
And in this field, I saw something that I think we're gonna thread in throughout this conversation because I know Jeremy has been seeing it as well. But Allison, it was not every plant down the row that I could pull up like this. It was probably every third. Somewhere between 25% to 35% were. Sorry, it was probably closer to two-thirds. A third of them, 25 to 35%, were so well anchored that I had no chance of getting them out of the ground, and the stalks were still in good shape. They were still standing. You can sort of see that from some of the pictures that I took. But
Mhm.
I would say, when you get 60% stock breakage, it certainly makes harvest challenging. And in this case, I think this was a situation where the rots actually came in a bit later, Allison, because the ears not only had pollinated well, but there was still what I would deem proper kernel depth and proper
Mhm.
color on those ears, which I don't have any pictures of. But obviously here the yield loss was a more direct fashion. It was because of the stock breakage and the inability to maybe pull some of those plants in. But the other thing I wanted to call out. The other hybrid was unaffected, as I mentioned, but that product was a 114-day hybrid that maturity wise is probably even fuller season. So that's one thing that was very hard to, as we talked through why we were having this issue, why there's separation difference. That is, I think, one factor that probably contributed.
I definitely agree with you that that maturity probably contributed, and um, you know that that I'm wondering, like, when was this harvested? Was it harvested quite kind of late? I mean, how long after physiological maturity?
It was a bit late.
Yeah,
It had been left in I think with the fuller season hybrid in there for them both to be, at the moisture
harvested
that
at
was
the same time.
desired. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Harvested probably same time. But yeah, very, very interesting. The other thing, the common thread, going back to I think the unevenness and why some of this was so bad. So this area was very dry. We're going to jump to that
Mm.
next. Um, Jeremy put these together, and Jeremy, I may pick on you to help me kind of
Sure.
interpret some of these, but Jeremy's kind of marked out some of the big rain events that this area got. And as you can see from July 15th, which by the way we were dry before July 15th, through August 21st, we had about an inch of recorded rain that we got over that span. Um, and then Jeremy, I think that's the temperature that you see on kind of in the middle across those lines.
Yeah, that red line across the top there is the mean
Mm.
temperature, high temperature. The blue line is the low,
Mm.
and that purple one is the mean in between both of them there. So you can see the spikes and valleys there where we hit some pretty warm temperatures, and then obviously some very low temperatures kind of scattered in throughout there. So, and then just the gaps in between the precipitation that fell down. I only ran July through October just because I went basically from pollination time to harvest, and
Right.
boy, there's a lot of gaps in there, and there's some heavy rainfall events in there too. So it just seems like there's a culmination of some things going on there where we really were able to stress some of these plants, and just seeing the differences in between the varieties and maturities there, I think this kind of helps explain some of that.
If you look there in, August 21st to September the 3rd, that was like 5 inches of rain in 2 weeks.
Right.
Yes.
Very, very wet. Yeah.
Especially on a very, if you think about your typical clarion soil types, a lot of clarion Nicolette Webster's, very heavy soil, a tiled field. When I actually pulled these plants, the soil was heavy enough that I could barely get a spade into the ground, even though it was late October. So certainly that contributed to it. I think one of the things that I'm seeing and that we're going to keep seeing in this field was actually some issues um, with planting. I found a few roots that had some compaction that was clearly showing. Even though again at planting this area was drier, but what I've gotten around to believing, and Jeremy, I know we'll get to this more later. I suspect in this field, like some of these others, some of those plants that were really strongly affected were um, plants that either emerged later or were maybe more shallow planted and just germinated at a different date, and those roots were sitting in a different soil level and went through maybe a little bit more stress because of that. So just a hunch that I think I saw here that we're going to get to, because I think Jeremy's seen a lot more of that inconsistency in planting uniformity than I maybe did. But um, we're going to kind of jump over towards eastern Iowa. So we've got a couple of fields here from the Brooklyn area, which, if you're not familiar, Brooklyn is um, over east of Newton, a ways, probably about 45 miles. Um, planted so late April, higher population on this field, not fungicided, and so this was a 107-day hybrid, but a product of ours, Allison and Jeremy, that I think actually has a good drought tolerance and above average agronomics. It's a very strong product from a disease standpoint as well. And when I was called out, one of the these pictures here where you can see the lodging and all the random plants that were still standing. When I pulled in, it looked like I had flashbacks to the derecho from 2020. It was very severely affected. Half of the plants were root lodged severely enough that the entire root mass was actually lifted out of the ground, and you could walk 100 feet, and every single plant was lifted with the root mass sitting on top of the soil. About 40% of the plants were actually lodged. The stalks were kinked about a foot or two above the ground, and there was not as much breakage there, but they were just kinked and bent over. Um, and then a good 10% of these plants were just standing perfectly. And the specific, I'll get into the specific weather event that caused this when we jump a few. Hold on, I guess let me jump to that real quick. So this area, as we talk about moisture, before I circle back, Allison, you mentioned the gap between rainfall events. This area was really very dry. The yield that this area made was good because they were wet earlier. This region had a really big rainstorm that kind of parked over the eastern part of the state early on, and then the rains that did get happened to be fairly timely. Otherwise, there was some really wide stretches here where there was, for me, it's that August 27th through October 25th as we're getting into those stages of grainfill where we just didn't pick up any moisture in this area. It was very dry. Um, so as we go back to this field, one thing that I noticed right away was I guess take you through how an agronomist diagnoses things. Why are 10% of these plants standing absolutely perfectly? I could not budge them. They were very well anchored, still very green, had really nice ears on them. And Allison, as I started digging at these roots, you can probably see what I'm looking at. Well, in this top picture here on the tailgate, you can see obviously some root deterioration. There's some pink in those stalks, right? Signs of
Mhm.
probably some Fusarium crown or maybe Gibbsella. But it's this picture down here, um, where you can see some regrowth on these brace roots. So this field was rotated, and the last time it was corn, it was planted. Half the field was planted in late May, and the other half was planted in early to mid June. And almost all of these plants that were root lodged, and even most that were stalk lodged, had close to a node of feeding from corn rootworm larvae. Something I did not expect, obviously being a long-term rotated field. So um, I think we talk as we. I guess Allison, this is where I kind of want to tee this up with you as I jump to this next image over here. Again, same area, very actually almost the same planting date, very similar look. Um, in this case, it was more like half of the plants were root lodged. Again, the similar situation with the root mass lifted above the ground. Um, the rest were all stock lodged, the same lodging that I saw in this other field. Again, these were maybe 10 miles apart. Um, the difference here was no corn rootworm feeding that I could find. Um, and that's what I wanted to talk about, Allison. What does corn rootworm feeding um, open up, I guess, from a stock and crown rot standpoint for these hybrids?
You do realize I'm a pathologist, right?
I know. Yes.
No pressure.
No pressure.
I mean, I would so corn rootworm feeding is going to be stressful on that plant, right?
Right.
Um, so to me, when I think about crown rots and stalk rots, any stress that that plant undergoes just um, freaks it out, and therefore it can't defend itself against those
Right.
crown and stalk rot organisms. And so I mean, there's the rootworm injury as a stock can leave an entry point, right, for these organisms to get in because they're lazy. They'll get in the easy way if they can, right? But then we also have the stress on the corn plant that it's it's trying to fill grain, but then it also has to defend itself against this infection that's coming in. And yeah. And
Absolutely.
so those, it's like us, right? When we're stressed, we're more susceptible to getting a cold, right? Um, so yeah, that's the way I
The
kind of look at it.
I'm not so sure that you're not also an entomologist, Allison. That was a great answer. The way I like to think of it, right, is the disease was knocking at the door, and the door was maybe shut until those roots got fed on a little bit. And the as Nick just said in the chat to me, the rootworm invited the disease. The one thing I wanted to say here, Jeremy, that I know you've seen a little bit of as well. In this case, this population of 36,000 is maybe not high on its own. And in a dry year, that's probably towards the upper limit that most people planted. But this was a very full season hybrid that we designate as a full flexor. So a lot of ear flex in this hybrid, and it's one that we've seen over time. It does not always respond very well to high populations. And I think in this field, in this particular case, that interplant competition on a hybrid that maybe does not enjoy that is just a response that this hybrid gave to the situation that maybe a different hybrid planted in those same conditions would not have. All right. jumping over to the last one that I wanted to talk through. This was a situation up in near Marshalltown. Planted again, similar planting date later in April. Um, Rotated field that Allison, the common thread, planted in early June in 2019. So I got called out to look at two different products, one ours, one that was not, and the two were similar in maturity, but difference in agronomics. One very strong from a drought tolerance and root and stalk perspective. The other one probably more below average, but carried some of that yield potential as we talked about earlier. And what I saw right away was differences between the two hybrids. The more defensive hybrid and also the fuller season hybrid. So I think that contributed as well. Had maybe a little crown rot, as you can see, but in general was unaffected. There was no lodging. Actually, the tops were still in, and it was actually out yielding the other hybrid fairly substantially. And that is this picture here, where you can still see, Allison, that the health of the pith, actually the outside, the rind was still green.
Mhm.
I was happy. This is what I wish every field looked like at harvest. And then with the 111 day, we had a lot more deterioration. Actually, the roots were very deteriorated, and we'll get to that here in a second. This is what I found just down the row, and then what I really noticed was the size in both stalk diameter and root mass. You can very clearly see just a lot more root mass on this 113 day compared to these plants from the other hybrid. What I did was I just went to the same point in the field and pulled seven plants up in a row, and looked at the differences, and I did that in a few places. So. What I think I was, actually seeing from a disease standpoint was a little bit of crown rot and maybe a little bit of diplodia, but it was very interesting to see the differences in how one hybrid handled, that stress compared to the other. In this field, there was also some very low level corn rootworm feeding, probably minor enough that you maybe wouldn't notice it. But I was actually in this field in July and was scouting it and noticed northern adults flying all over the place, and was able to collect some and actually submit them. So um, know that there was also maybe a slight issue with northern corn rootworm in this field uh, as well. Um, this area was, I guess, kind of the common thread again, those gaps between rainfall, the stress that this area was under, um, especially early on in the growing season. One thing I wanted to ask, a question that I kind of came up with, Allison, is there something to, as we think about the way that our weather has changed, taking our seasonal rainfall and spreading it out from a bunch of smaller rains to some of these larger rain events? I guess as we jump backwards to Powesheik County, right, where we see
Mhm.
these really big rain events. Do you think that maybe this is maybe more of a thought experiment? Do you think catching 2.5 inches of rain in one event maybe poses different risks for infection than maybe catching some smaller rains throughout the summer?
I think that's a good question. Possibly, I mean, those big. I'm trying to remember if those big rain events came with a lot of wind and quite heavy, like thunderstorms, etc. Wind damage,
The
as
late,
a
I guess, Allison, in this area, the late August ones did. That was where
yeah,
some of the really severe lodging north of Highway 20
yeah.
occurred. Most of that damage was farther north, but this is not all that far away from that area.
Yeah, I know, because I checked on that actually when you sent me the slides. I was like, was this in that area that got the bad wind? And then I saw it was just a little bit out of it. So, um, yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, with these, these more severe weather events that we have that can come with wind and it can come with hail and um, I guess just a little bit of lodging of those plants might physically break some of those roots or those nodal roots, and maybe we could get infection through there. I just, I really don't know. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I don't know. I would, I, I
I
think
wasn't trying to I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. It's something that I just think is interesting. It does
yeah,
seem that our weather has changed that way, right? We're maybe going to be a little drier in the summers, and when we catch rain, we seem to get a lot all at once. So it's just
yeah.
something that I've noticed that's interesting. Um, Jeremy, I'm going to hand this off to you for some of the issues you've had, and in further eastern Iowa? Because it's probably a little bit different than the few scenarios that I walked through.
Slightly different, Matt, but yeah, this is probably the general issue that I've been running into the past couple of weeks here. Got two different hybrids here, both of them 113-day, both really good as far as natural stress tolerance. One is a fixed hybrid on the left, one is a flex hybrid on the right, both planted at proper populations and split planted within the same field. But you can see noticeably different. And I think if you hit the next slide, Matt, you can see just kind of the side by side between the two there. You can, if you hit it one more time, it'll put the line in there, but you can pretty much see it right there. Um, just that's been the issue, and the topic of conversation is, we were really short of rainfall in Cedar County. That's where this photo was taken here last Friday. We've got guys going any direction they can to pick up uh, all the ears and stalks that they can. We got out and actually looked at both hybrids right where this picture was taken, and the ears were filled nicely. Where we could pick up corn on the left side there with that particular hybrid, yields were very good, considering the rainfall that came through there. And it's just better standability and easier combining on the right hand side, and the yields were
Right.
still good, if not, obviously better, just because we could get more ears into the combine head. So in this particular area in Cedar County, that's been the question. The $1 million question is, what happened? Why is this hybrid doing this? In the same field, and it could be similar, same company like these two are, or even different varieties or one across the road. Why is this one down, and why is this one not standing or standing much better? So yeah, that's been the struggle this year. And just in that particular area, if you look at the weather data, I think that's the next slide,
Yeah, we'll
Matt.
jump real quick.
So Jeremy,
Okay,
I have a question about that.
sure.
That field.
Yes,
You had a flexed and fixed. So
correct.
what was there a difference in ear size between the two hybrids?
Slightly bigger in the flex hybrid,
Okay.
better standability overall. But just between the two hybrids, knowing them, it was definitely smaller in the fixed ear, but I wouldn't say by not significantly, not like it was throwing the little, ones the size of your hand or anything like that. It did look like
Right.
the ears pollinated and filled nicely, but were a little bit smaller than the flex hybrid.
Okay. I was just wondering because that's what I was thinking, that maybe with that fixed ear it just puts more stress on the plant to fill the ear,
Mhm.
and so more stress equals more problems with stalk rot. But if the ears were the same size, then yeah, it makes me question that thought. So
It just made me think about, and something we talked about earlier, about population and how in a normal year, a hybrid the hybrid on the left there, the fixed year hybrid, been around for a while, very high volume product, is on a lot of acres, has performed quite well
yeah,
until this year. And it just seemed like this year there was a culmination of things that we're trying to figure out that came together that just really put the stocks to the test. So we're wondering if in a stressful area where, limited precip, all of a sudden we have more plant to plant competition there with
yeah,
36,000 versus 32,000. And with limited rainfall, we go to the stocks and cannibalize the stocks sooner
mhm,
just because we're under stress more.
exactly. Yeah,
Just kind of got me
Yep.
thinking about those types of things.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And this is that same fixed year hybrid in a different field. This is in Jackson County, and again, kind of like the pictures that Matt showed there. Smaller root masses this year seems to be one of the key things that I'm seeing, especially in East Central and a little bit into Southeast Iowa. You can't go too far in Southeast Iowa. Believe it or not, they had too much rain, so it's been crazy.
Very true.
But let's just say East Central Iowa, that Jackson County, Clinton County, Muscatine County, lots smaller root masses this year. Just your thoughts on, I look back at the planting season, and we were very dry through April. I mean, it's probably one of the fastest planting seasons any of us have ever
Yeah.
seen in a long time. um, any thoughts on the cool temperatures or cool soils, just holding that root development back, and then maybe just staying behind? I know this is really probably
So this is
getting in there, but
agronomy now, right?
yeah,
You
Yes.
do realize I'm a specialist, right? You guys are the jack of all trades. I'm the specialist here. Um, I mean, I'm kind of surprised at these small roots because I would have thought that we would have had bigger roots just because that plant would have been so desperate to find water, right? That it would have
Right.
just been shooting out all these roots. So, um, from what I know about agronomy, that just doesn't make sense. And when I think in terms of pathology, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Cooler soil temperatures, maybe, I mean, yeah, that's going to slow growth a little bit, but I have no good explanations. I'm sorry.
And
No
and
ugly.
Allison, in a lot of fields, to your point, with the weather that we had, the roots did grow down and chase moisture for a lot of areas. I just for me, Jeremy, some of it I think, and again for those listening, we're diagnosing on the fly here, and we're never gonna trying to find the answers this year, and like any year is always difficult, but it planting depth, um and I think a lot of roots, well, one, a lot of seeds sat in dry soil for sometimes several weeks before they had a chance to germinate, but plants sat in, when those roots came out in some of these areas that were exceedingly dry. Those nodal roots do need moisture to continue to divide and elongate and continue to explore soil. So some of it does wonder if we had issues with, with how dry planting actually was, if that did cause some problems with root development. And I think that's certainly possible. One thing I did want to look at, Jeremy, just looking at the rain for this area, if
Yeah.
you go from July 1st through September, before September 4th, you roughly had 2 inches of rainfall. Where corn plants are using what, just under a quarter of an inch a day, 2/10 of an inch a day, whatever it might be during. And now that amount changes until we get to tassel. That's a lot of moisture that we did not have in this area.
Well, and then you look at between October 14th and 25th, and that total amount there was more than we had, for the entire
Prior,
summer.
absolutely, from July on,
Yeah.
right?
Stock cannibalization was huge in this area. It was amazing to see the ears filled out the way they were. You think of drought in hybrid zippering, especially like, drought during pollination, but it seems like these caught just enough rain at the right time to pollinate well. But boy, when it came down to finishing those ears off, the stalks really just hollowed themselves out, and the roots then
Right.
went with it with some of the diseases we're talking about. So it's just really interesting in this neck of the woods here.
And Jeremy, I know you've made good points on getting into what we learned from this year. Just one thing about cannibalization is that that plant wants its life goal, its hope and dream, its purpose is to put on viable seed, um, however it has to do it, right? If it's dry, damn the torpedoes, it's going to take energy from the stalk, and sometimes even from the ear shank. I've seen that too.
Yep.
So that's one thing that does get lost, right? I've been trying to draw this connection in people's minds this year, Allison. It's if you fertilized for 225 bushel corn and we're dry all summer and you're getting fields averaging 265 across the scale, or 285 across the scale, and you're shocked and wonder where that yield came from. I think in a lot of these fields, where it came from, what gave, something had to give in that equation. I think in a lot of cases it was the stock,
Mhm.
and it's something that I think I've seen that in almost every field that I've been in. Iowa State was very upfront. I think, both Alice and the extension agronomist saying, "Hey, this is not the year to let corn sit out in the field and dry to 16%, um, because of how much energy went from the stalk into those kernels during grain fill." So, Jeremy, you mentioned cannibalization. I just wanted to circle back to that. I think that's something we need to make sure people are aware of. That it not only happened this year, we saw a lot of it, and that's what got us to the yields we achieved.
No, I think you're right. And then, like Allison has been talking about, you weaken those plants up. They can't fight off diseases, and stalk rots and root rots come on in and end the party.
I was reading something physiologically. I did not know this, that when they are cannibalizing the stalk, plants kind of have a priority list of actions all cells do, in a sense, and they actually deprioritize making chemicals and compounds that can fight off things like
Mhm.
diseases and
Yep.
infections while they're in the process of cannibalizing the stock. So there's that physical weakening, right? Stock strength is essentially that, how strong is your rind, and then that pith supports it. So when you lose pith, now obviously you've weakened that stalk, but on top of it, if the plant is not defending itself like normal, you just kind of delivered a double whammy to that plant's immune system.
Snowballs from there, don't it?
That's right. All right. So Jeremy, let's kind of walk through these. What happened to this crop from pollination to maturity? Let's kind of recap what we think we saw.
Oh boy. From my side of it, from pollination to maturity, pretty good swings in temperature. I think we lucked out with a couple of good rainfalls to set us up to have a huge crop. I think grain fill was probably our biggest detriment as far as not having enough moisture to really just kind of help that plant finish itself off. We've talked about weakening plants and stock cannibalization, and I think that's where we ended up. In my territory, for the most part, I think this is a lot of what I was seeing. How about you?
Yeah, I would agree. One thing I wanted to throw out there that I think had an impact was the amount of warm nights that we had, not allowing that plant to catch a break from respiration. Allison, anything that you think we maybe didn't hit on? I think obviously the weather is and the environment's probably the key
Yeah.
factor here.
I mean, we got amazing yields, right? Considering
We
the
did.
season that we had. And so I think that we really ought to give those plants some credits, and maybe even the breeders, right? Is that it was it was a really tough year, and yet that plant pushed its way all the way and did everything it could to get to the finish line. And I'm just amazed. So
I would
I mean,
agree.
if,
I had
you know,
somebody actually ask me. We have a biotech trait, the drought guard trait, right? That changes water use efficiency. I had somebody ask, if my other hybrids with like an average drought score got me 270 bushel corn, do I actually need one of those traits? Like it was just a very funny because he's right. Allison, I've had that question a lot. Where did this come from? And it's kind of
yeah,
hard to help unpack it. And I think you're right. Modern breeding and the way we've been able to select products with better stress tolerance, I think does get some credit there.
yeah.
Um, in terms of specific times, events, insects that cause standability issues, I think we've already covered corn rootworm, how that can be
Mhm.
a gateway to some of these problems. And as you mentioned, Allison, really any sort of pest that causes those wounds. But in terms of times and events, for me, what it really comes down to is how dry August was for most areas, especially considering how dry we were going into that time of the year. Pollination went well in most places. There was not a lot of tip back or silk balling you might expect to see during a hot, dry year. So for me, as I look at these fields, Allison, we went through these scenarios. The common thread for all of these was those ears were all as large as would match the yield results that we're seeing. In a lot of cases, it was either the stalk that was bad late in the season, or on some of these, I've gone in fields and found really nice ears with kernels that are slightly larger than BBs because that plant died early.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, as you mentioned, right, it's not it's the prevalence of that disease. Did it show up early or late? It can infect any time, and I think specific time. That's the challenge with a year like this. It's probably going to vary field to field.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, Allison, we'll throw this one to you. But do you think there were any specific stalk rots or root rots, diseases what were that you've seen more of this year maybe than in years past? And could you put your finger on maybe why that would be?
I mean, I think that we saw more Gibbsella stalk rot than we have, um,
I would agree.
and I kind of put that to that late August rains that came through. It was very wet, so we were kind of midway through grainfill then. So I would say that that disease was that that was worse than in previous years. And then, I mean, I do think that crown rot is increasing, you know, um, and so, but I don't know that that was any worse than it was last year. So maybe a little bit. I think it's on the increase, but yeah, I mean,
I was going to put you on the spot when we were talking about Fusarium crown rot, but like, was there a particular time, maybe a year or 2 or 3 years ago when you said, "Oh boy, this is really starting to, this is something we should be paying attention to. This is definitely
Yes.
happening more often than not. Did you have an event like that or an aha moment where you
Oh,
started
yeah,
thinking that?
definitely. In one of my trials, actually, we had a couple of hybrids in that trial. It was a trial for, I think it was for Physoderma, and we actually had a ton of tar spot in that trial. That was the first time that we had tar spot here in central Iowa. But there was crown rot that came in to one of those hybrids compared to, and then I was out there with, the company breeder, and so we talked a little bit about that, and then I've had people at extension events come up to me and, I'm seeing more crown rot. I'm seeing more crown rot. So I would say, last 3 or 4 years, there just seems to be a lot more questions about crown rot. And I definitely notice it more, going out there mid grain fill and around about dough, and all of a sudden you just see these ghosts, right? And
Yep.
chop the plant, and there it is, that crown rot. So, yeah.
You said the trigger word for me, tar spot. We don't even have to guess what counties they're in, or it's in Iowa anymore, or even
No.
into eastern Nebraska. Thoughts on that disease and how it impacted growth and development this year and what you're seeing?
I think out in eastern Iowa that it probably affected um, the corn more, but nothing like compared to Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana. Those guys out east, they got really hammered with tar spot. My concern, is that we had a very dry growing season, right? And that's not favorable for tar spot. And so, I mean, the fact that we now know it's been found in every county, that means that inoculum is there, it's going to survive. And so that has me concerned for, next year, if we have a wet growing season. I think that we're really going to have to watch out for tar spot, especially as, we don't have any resistance yet, right? So it's not like you can choose a hybrid. So I mean, it is a big concern, and we'll be keeping an eye on it, as I'm sure you guys will be as well.
Yeah, I know my moment with my aha moment with tar spot was I covering Western Iowa. I just was blissfully ignorant. I was like, that's an Illinois problem, right? It won't make its way over here. And then I walked into one of my plots, Allison, and it was every entry, regardless of company, had what I
Yeah.
would describe as severe levels of tar spot. This was in Story County this year, actually,
Okay.
and I've seen it in Audubon, Madison, Guthrie. I mean, as far west as you
Yeah.
want to go, it's definitely there.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's amazing how quickly it spread. So
Ab- no, absolutely. That's actually these two things are kind of related, Allison. We spoke about this a little bit earlier, but uh, what are some of the challenges in our way, with crown rot, it's and tar spot? I actually kind of see them as somewhat related. It increasing prevalence now. We're not 100% certain, that we know a lot about these diseases. With tar spot, so much of what we know comes from Central America and does not seem to really apply to here. So um what are, obviously fungicide is something that can help with tar spot. um what is so challenging with trying to effectively screen for these products, or give accurate ratings? Because I know that's something that everybody has been talking about. Is there anything specific that makes those challenging?
crown rot and tar spot, or I
Um,
because I'm
for,
struggling
I
with your
asked the question
question a
for
bit.
for tar spot. Sorry.
Okay. Well, one of the things about tar spot is that we cannot grow that in the lab, right? And so that's something that we're struggling with at the moment, is how do we get inoculum? How can we grow this pathogen up and then use it to screen plants, right? And so, at the moment, it's a little bit like Physoderma and then stockrot, like we talked about earlier, right? Where you have to collect the inoculum from the previous season, grind it up, put it in the wall of the plant, you know, irrigate it, and then hope that you get disease developing. So you've got to walk through each individual plant, right? And
Right.
and some plants are going to get disease and others are not. And yeah, it's just, I can't explain it. But yeah, I mean,
It's challenging.
yes, it's challenging. So, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, jumping to, okay, we kind of already talked about this, but did relative maturity matter? we definitely noticed some differences in a few of the snares we talked about on this podcast. We saw some differences, but one thing I know Jeremy wanted to call out is, and Allison, you're not an agronomist, but you understand this as well, as when we slam everything into the ground in 4 or 5 days, we really don't give ourselves much leeway from a risk tolerance standpoint. All right. Same with this, Jeremy. We kind of already hit on this. Thoughts on how uneven emergence impacted stock quality late season. Jeremy's actually got some great pictures, Allison, but I've seen this as well. Those late emergers that came up. In my opinion, what I saw, this goes back to planting for those listening. We were very dry, and as we moved down in the furrow looking for moisture, that furrow got wider. As you think about how a V opening, a V disc opener operates, that caused issues with furrow stability. If there was no shoe holding that furrow open, the furrow collapsed. As we were using some of these high speed, you know, 40 row planters, Allison, those, the faster we went, it seemed like the worse the problem got. And also the ground was very hard, especially if you were no tilling or planting into a cover crop, right? If you had super dry soil, as those of you know, is very hard, and it's very hard to get seed into the ground. So what I've been seeing, and I think as well as Jeremy, are a lot of these late emergers that were maybe planted on top of the ground or in a half inch of dry soil. Took 2 or 3 weeks to finally get enough moisture to germinate. The stalks were thinner, the height overall was reduced, and the ears then the root mass was also much smaller. And I think in some cases there were probably whole fields that looked like that, depending on how deep and even they were able to get the seed into the ground. So I guess the moral of the story here, it goes back to, what do we say, Jeremy? The sins of planting will haunt you all year.
Yes, and you talked about no-till planting and the residue management, and we we can't just look at a growing season. We have to look at what happened previously, right? So I look at some of the fields that I was visiting with farmers with this year, derecho fields that were maybe chiseled and disked twice last fall and maybe even twice this spring. So like you're planting into cotton balls there, and some of that soil was just so dry without any rain in April, basically. So fluffy that I think in some instances we did have some issues. I know we had some issues with uneven planting depth or seed just not hitting the bottom of that trench before the trench closed. I'm not saying that's the silver bullet for all of these uneven or late emerging plants, but I did see some of that this year too. So and they
Yep.
got disease first and went.
It's just hard to make that connection, Allison, when you're evaluating a stand with a farmer of seeds that were planted at half an inch, and you're a month into the growing season and it's very uneven. To draw that connection that we might get more stock rot because of this in October. That's kind of a hard leap to make when it's May 12th and you're looking at an uneven stand. But we definitely did see that this year.
Mhm.
I think that that is it's also important to get out in your fields several times during the growing season, right, to see what's going on. So,
Absolutely.
and at the end of, going out into the field now on November the 8th and looking at all this lodged corn and trying to determine what went wrong, it would have been helpful if we had some kind of in-season information as well. So,
And Allison, that actually perfectly ties into our last bullet point. Trying to post-mortem on November 8th is very difficult. And scouting for from emergence all the way through the growing season is what's important. And it's what I'm really going to be recommending to the people that I work with for next year, Allison and Jeremy. And that's, be aware of what's going on in these fields. If we see issues, can we try to prioritize them for maybe an earlier harvest or for
mhm,
some other kind of management? I think with tar spot, I've been encouraging farmers to, if they were going to spray fungicide, spray their normal VTR1 application. But if you're in a heavy pressure area, you may have to scout within, 30 to 40 days to see if it is coming back in again, and,
mhm,
and maybe even consider a second application. So that's kind of the moral of the story is when Jeremy gets called and says, what happened in this field? It's not as simple as, do you have 2 minutes? It's, do you have 2 days, essentially, is what a lot of these things wind up being. So um, and we've tried to get as much as we can in the hour we've done this. So um, we're we're thankful for one, for all the farmers and all of our dealers out there who've been kind of dealing with these issues. And Jeremy and I are certainly in the boat paddling alongside you. And I know Allison and Iowa State have been great references as well. Is there anything in closing that you wanted to add, Allison, as we thank you for joining us for this training?
I want to thank you for having me, and I learned a lot as well. So yeah, thanks for having me. I don't have anything to add except for stop the truck, get out, and walk in the field.
Yes,
It's not that
absolutely.
horrible, I promise.
Any anything you want to plug before we go? I know the ISU ICM conference is coming up soon.
Yes.
Jeremy and I will be in attendance. We wouldn't miss it. But anything about sending samples or just anything that your lab is doing that you want to share?
Well, you can always send samples to the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic at Iowa State, and they can help with diagnosis. We are doing a little bit of work on the side, kind of looking at crown rot and stalk rots and seeing if we can understand, how fungicides impact those. So it's, yeah, it's dirty work and it takes a long time, and there's not a lot of money for corn research, so that's our struggle. So but yeah, it was good to be here this afternoon, and like I said, I learned a lot too.
Well, Allison, I can't thank you enough. You're a great resource from Iowa State Extension, and you've always been very helpful. Anytime we've had Matt and I've been racking our brains on things, it's always nice to get another brain involved. So we're certainly very thankful that you were able to join us and provide some insight
Thank
on
you.
this today.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for watching.